Tonight, millions of Americans will slide behind a steering wheel carrying proof that the government has examined them, photographed them, recorded their identity, and decided they are qualified to control a machine capable of killing someone in seconds. But once in America, that proof did not exist. Neither did the examination, neither did the permission. If you could buy, borrow, or build an automobile, you could point it toward a crowded street and drive. You could be 12 years old. You could have no training, no understanding of brakes, and no idea which side of the road to use. The law did not ask whether you were capable. It barely understood what you were driving. That is the world America entered at the birth of the automobile. A world with no universal license, no road test, no written examination, no standard minimum age, and almost no shared rules. The vehicle beneath you might have a steering wheel, a tiller, or controls, unlike anything your neighbor had ever seen. It might run on gasoline, steam, or electricity. It might stop when commanded, or it might not. Yet possession was effectively permission. The moment an owner managed to start the engine, the public street became his testing ground. Today, this feels almost impossible. Before most Americans can drive legally, they must study signs, learn right-of-way rules, pass an examination, practice under supervision, and demonstrate control of a vehicle while an evaluator watches every turn. The license in a wallet appears ordinary, but it represents a bargain. Society grants mobility only after receiving at least some evidence of competence. Early motorists made no such bargain. They entered public space first, caused the consequences second, and left government struggling to invent rules afterward. To understand how that happened, forget the modern street. Erase the painted lanes, traffic signals, stop signs, crosswalks, parking spaces, turning arrows, speed limit signs, and concrete barriers. Remove the assumption that the road belongs primarily to automobiles. Now imagine an American city around 1900. The street is not merely a channel carrying traffic. It is a public room beneath the open sky. Children play only a few steps from moving wagons. Vendors position carts beside storefronts and call to passing customers. Neighbors pause in the roadway to exchange news. Couples stroll without waiting for a signal because no signal exists. Horses pull carriages through the crowd. Streetcars follow metal rails. Delivery wagons stop wherever their work requires. And pedestrians move through everything without feeling that they have entered forbidden territory. For generations, streets had belonged to everyone. They connected homes and businesses, but they were also places of commerce, conversation, work, and play. A pedestrian did not stand obediently at a corner waiting for machinery to grant permission to cross. People simply walked. Carriage drivers were expected to control their animals and accommodate the vulnerable people around them. The greater danger carried the greater responsibility. Then, a sound no city had evolved to understand began coming down the road. The cough, rattle, hiss, and explosive vibration of the automobile. Early cars did not arrive as polished, dependable products. Many were handmade experiments assembled by inventors, mechanics, and wealthy enthusiasts. Some resembled carriages with their horses mysteriously removed. Others looked like engines, wheels, pipes, and seats had been fastened together during an argument. There was no universal design because no one yet knew what the automobile should become. Steam cars could be powerful, but required preparation and carried hot boilers. Electric vehicles were quiet and comparatively easy to operate, but limited by their batteries. Gasoline machines were noisy, dirty, difficult to start, and increasingly capable of frightening speed. Even basic controls varied from one manufacturer to another. A driver trained on one machine could sit inside another and find an unfamiliar system of levers, pedals, chains, and hand controls. Some vehicles steered with tillers rather than wheels. Some offered little protection from weather or collision. Braking systems could be weak, inconsistent, or useless on a steep road. Mechanical failure was not an exceptional event. It was part of the experience. And still, there was no official gatekeeper. No Department of Motor Vehicles had developed a mature system for deciding who was competent. No nationwide standards defined safe operation. No instructor needed to approve you. No insurer demanded proof of training. In many places, no official record even connected a machine to its owner. The automobile had arrived before the institutions required to govern it. At first, that absence did not appear completely irrational. Cars were rare. Around the turn of the century, seeing one could draw a crowd. Horses vastly outnumbered engines, and many citizens considered automobiles expensive toys that would never replace familiar transportation. Why create an elaborate bureaucracy for a machine encountered only occasionally? Why require special permission to operate what lawmakers regarded as another kind of carriage? That reasoning contained a fatal mistake. A horse possessed instincts. It could hesitate at an obstacle, react to danger, or resist a reckless command. A motor vehicle possessed no judgment at all. It converted the decisions of its operator directly into motion, even when that operator was confused, careless, intoxicated, inexperienced, or terrified. The machine offered power without wisdom, and the law treated access to that power as a private matter. Imagine receiving one of those vehicles with no instructor beside you. There is no handbook because the shared rules have not been written. You learn by pulling levers, listening to the engine, and discovering what happens. Perhaps the seller gives you a brief explanation. Perhaps a friend demonstrates the controls. Perhaps you teach yourself on the same crowded road used by children, horses, workers, and streetcars. Nothing prevents a young child from attempting it. Nothing requires an elderly beginner to prove adequate vision or reaction time. Nothing establishes that two approaching drivers understand who should yield. Speed itself is unfamiliar to the public. A machine moving 20 miles per hour may sound slow today, but in a crowded street organized around walking and horses, it arrives with terrifying force. That warning became impossible to ignore in New York in 1899. Henry Bliss, a 69-year-old real estate dealer, stepped from a streetcar near Central Park West. He turned, reportedly to help another passenger descend. An electric taxicab approached and struck him. Bliss was knocked down and crushed beneath the vehicle. He died the following morning. Pause inside that intersection. There is no red light ordering the taxi to stop. No painted lane separates it from other movement. No standardized crossing tells Bliss where his protection begins. No licensing examination has established that the operator understands safe stopping distance, pedestrian priority, or emergency control. A new machine and an old street have met, and a man has paid for the incompatibility with his life. The driver was arrested, but the death was considered unintentional, exposing a question America had barely begun to ask. If an operator had never been required to demonstrate competence, what standard could determine negligence? Could society blame one person for failing rules that society itself had not created? Or did controlling a dangerous machine impose an obvious duty even before officials wrote it down? In 1903, Massachusetts and Missouri introduced requirements commonly identified with the beginning of state driver licensing. It sounds like the moment safety finally arrived. It was not. These early documents generally did not represent a modern judgment of competence. An applicant could provide information, pay a fee, and receive authorization without proving through a meaningful road examination that he could safely control the machine. The distinction matters. Registration tells the government who you are. Testing asks whether you should be trusted with the power you seek to operate. Early licensing often answered the first question while avoiding the second. A piece of paper could identify the driver after a disaster, but it did little to prevent an incapable driver from causing one. But those licenses created a question. If officials merely recorded a driver's name without testing ability, had America made its streets safer, or had it only placed paperwork over the chaos accelerating beneath it? At the center of that transformation stood Henry Ford and the Model T. When Ford introduced the car in 1908, it remained beyond the reach of many families. But Ford was determined to make automobile ownership ordinary. Through standardized parts, relentless cost-cutting, and the moving assembly line, his factories produced vehicles faster and more cheaply than the country had imagined possible. The machine, once displayed as a rich man's toy, was becoming a working family's passport to independence. The numbers rose with breathtaking force. In the opening years of the 20th century, automobiles were rare enough to attract spectators. By 1909, roughly 200,000 motorized vehicles traveled American roads. By 1916, the number had climbed into the millions. By 1920, more than 8 million automobiles were registered. The streets shaped over generations for walking, horses, carts, and streetcars were suddenly absorbing machines whose speed and weight changed the meaning of every mistake. Picture an intersection during that transition. One driver believes the larger road gives him priority. Another thinks the vehicle arriving first should proceed. A pedestrian crosses according to customs learned before automobiles existed. A horse panics at the sound of an engine. A streetcar cannot turn away. No painted lines separate their paths. No signal assigns them time. And no universal handbook tells them whose understanding is correct. Everyone enters the same space, carrying different rules inside their head. The consequences were brutal. Detroit, the city manufacturing the automotive future, also became one of the clearest demonstrations of its cost. During 2 summer months in 1908, 31 people reportedly died in automobile crashes there. By 1917, Detroit and its surrounding communities recorded thousands of accidents in a single year, with pedestrians representing most of the fatalities. The city producing mobility was simultaneously producing a new category of public grief. Nationally, deaths climbed as ownership expanded. Thousands were killed annually by the 1910s. By 1920, the number exceeded 15,000 in a year, and the following decade brought a toll comparable to the losses of war. Yet, statistics alone conceal what communities actually experienced. Children killed near their homes, workers struck while crossing familiar streets, and families discovering that an ordinary walk could end beneath a machine controlled by someone who had never been tested. That anger created pressure for meaningful licensing. Rhode Island began requiring drivers to demonstrate ability in 1908, becoming an early state to move beyond simple identification. New Jersey later required both written questions and a practical road examination. These measures introduced a principle that now seems self-evident. Paying for permission was not enough. Before controlling a dangerous machine in public, an applicant should prove some knowledge and skill. By 1930, only about half the states required drivers to carry licenses, and fewer demanded meaningful examinations. The delay seems incomprehensible when placed beside the death toll. If communities feared automobiles, newspapers publicized fatalities, and early tests just demonstrated an obvious solution. Why did stronger requirements spread so slowly? The answer was not merely administrative confusion or American attachment to freedom. An increasingly wealthy collection of businesses had begun fighting to control how the crisis itself was understood. Automobile manufacturers were only one part of this emerging power. Dealers needed sales, oil companies needed drivers consuming fuel, tire manufacturers needed vehicles covering miles. Road builders needed public investment in highways. Automobile clubs wanted fewer restrictions on their members. Together, these interests formed a political and cultural coalition, sometimes called Motordom. Its prosperity depended on convincing Americans that the country needed more cars, more roads, and fewer barriers between consumers and driving. Motordom faced a genuine threat. As casualties mounted, city leaders considered strict speed limits, mechanical governors, and restrictions on where automobiles could operate. Some citizens wanted cars treated as dangerous machinery rather than ordinary private property. If those ideas prevailed, the mass market might collapse. The industry therefore needed more than safer engineering. It needed a new story, one in which the automobile remained the hero of progress and someone else became responsible for the bloodshed. For generations, the cultural assumption had been simple. Streets belonged to the public, and operators of faster, heavier vehicles were obligated to protect those around them. The automobile industry worked to reverse that assumption. Instead of asking why motorists were driving dangerously through pedestrian space, campaigns asked why pedestrians were standing in automobile space. Responsibility moved away from the person controlling the machine and toward the person vulnerable to it. The campaign's most effective weapon was not a law or invention. It was an insult, jaywalker. At the time, jay described an unsophisticated country person, someone supposedly too ignorant to understand city behavior. Calling a pedestrian a jaywalker did more than identify where that person crossed. It portrayed the pedestrian as backward, foolish, and personally responsible for failing to adapt to the modern world. Automobile organizations and their allies spread the term aggressively. Safety materials warned people to cross only where authorities instructed. Newspapers received accident information framed around pedestrian error. Boy Scouts distributed cards. Public demonstrations ridiculed people who entered streets outside designated areas. In staged events, actors dressed as rural fools were mocked for misunderstanding traffic. Humor performed the work of power. It trained the public to laugh at the victim before asking what the driver had done. One parade displayed a mock tombstone dedicated to a fictional Mr. Jaywalker, implying that his death resulted from stepping into the street without looking. The message was clever, memorable, and devastatingly effective. The automobile was transformed from the dangerous newcomer into the natural master of the road. The pedestrian, whose legal and cultural claim to the street was centuries old, became an obstacle violating modern order. Newspaper language began changing. Reports that had emphasized reckless motorists increasingly described careless pedestrians. Cities adopted ordinances restricting where people could cross. Kansas City criminalized jaywalking, and Los Angeles followed. Crosswalks did not merely protect pedestrians, they also confined them. The street remained public property on paper, but its practical ownership had shifted. Walking outside approved boundaries became deviant behavior, while driving through the center became normal. This transformation weakened the urgency of strict driver regulation. If collisions occurred because pedestrians behaved irresponsibly, then testing motorists appeared less central to the solution. Officials could educate children, punish walkers, widen roads, install signals, and preserve easy access to automobiles. The industry did not need to deny the deaths. It needed only to redefine their cause. None of this means traffic rules were unnecessary. Signals, crossings, and predictable movement saved lives in increasingly crowded cities, but the distribution of responsibility mattered. A safety system could restrain the most dangerous participants, or it could demand that everyone else retreat from them. America increasingly chose the second path, allowing the automobile's commercial expansion to continue while pedestrians surrendered space they had once used freely. The strategy succeeded because it appealed to more than corporate profit. Cars promised personal freedom, social status, privacy, and escape. Motorists wanted to believe their machines represented progress rather than danger. Politicians wanted factories and jobs. Cities wanted economic growth. When industry messaging offered a future where automobiles could flourish and fatalities could be blamed on individual carelessness, millions of Americans found the story convenient. Meanwhile, licenses continued spreading slowly and unevenly. Some states developed better examinations, learner permits, and age restrictions. Others continued handing out documents that proved identity, but little else. The country was building traffic signals and prosecuting pedestrians faster than it was ensuring every driver could operate safely. The original question, who should be trusted behind the wheel, was being buried beneath a different command. Everyone else must get out of the way. And this is why 1903 was not the end of automotive anarchy. It was only the beginning of a 56-year struggle over competence, freedom, responsibility, and power. America had recognized that drivers could be recorded, but it had not agreed that they must be tested. Before that principle reached every state, millions more vehicles would arrive. Generations would learn to treat roads as automobile territory, and the final holdouts would resist until the middle of the 20th century. The final holdouts reveal how slowly America converted the idea of licensing into an actual standard of competence. By 1930, automobiles had transformed commerce, housing, employment, and personal identity, yet roughly half the states still did not require every motorist to hold a license. Even among states issuing licenses, many demanded little or no proof of ability. The nation had accepted the car as essential before agreeing that its operator should understand how to control it. Missouri offered the sharpest irony. It had been one of the first states associated with driver licensing in 1903, yet it did not require a practical driving examination until 1952. For nearly half a century, the state could identify many drivers without establishing that they could drive. The document looked official, carried legal authority, and created public confidence, but its existence could conceal how little qualification stood behind it. Other states delayed almost as dramatically. Arizona waited until the early 1950s to require testing. Illinois followed during that decade. Wisconsin and Alaska waited until the mid-1950s. South Dakota became the last state to require licenses in 1954 and did not adopt a driving examination until 1959. 56 years separated the first state licensing requirements from nationwide testing. A child born when licensing began could have become a grandparent before every state demanded demonstrated competence. Even Henry Ford embodied the gap between technological power and public regulation. The manufacturer who did more than almost anyone to place automobiles in ordinary hands reportedly received his first driver's license in 1919 when he was 56. He had built cars, driven cars, and created an industrial empire around cars before his home state required the familiar proof of official permission. Innovation was not waiting for law. Law was chasing innovation from miles behind. The octagonal stop sign followed similar logic. Its distinctive shape allowed drivers approaching from behind to recognize that opposing traffic faced a command to stop, even when the words were invisible. Road design was becoming a language made from color, geometry, placement, and expectation. But learning that language still depended on the operator. A sign could communicate a rule. It could not guarantee that the person reading it understood or respected it. This is why infrastructure could never fully replace training. Officials could paint lanes, erect signs, and install lights, but a driver still needed judgment. How much distance was required to stop, when weather reduced control, how to respond to a pedestrian, and when possessing the right-of-way did not make proceeding safe. Regulation slowly recognized that lawful driving involved more than manipulating controls. It required interpreting danger before danger became impact. Learner permits represented an important change because they recognized that ability develops through supervised practice. Written examinations tested whether applicants understood shared rules. Road tests placed them inside the environment where mistakes mattered. Renewal requirements acknowledged that permission could expire or require review. None of these measures made roads harmless, but together they established a principle missing from the earliest era. Driving was not simply ownership exercised in public, it was a conditional privilege carrying obligations to strangers. By 1959, when South Dakota finally required an examination, the basic national expectation was complete. Every state now demanded a license, and every state required some demonstration of ability. Yet the victory was less complete than it appeared. Tests could be brief and inconsistent. Enforcement remained uneven. Unlicensed driving continued. Political culture still treated restrictions as intrusions on personal freedom, even though one person's freedom behind the wheel could permanently erase another person's freedom to return home. The license, nevertheless, became one of the most powerful symbols in American adolescence. Receiving it meant independence from parents, access to work, private movement, romance, travel, and adulthood. Films and advertisements transformed the first car into a promise that life could finally begin. What started as reluctant government oversight became a ritual desired by young people because the nation had redesigned opportunity around the assumption that mobility meant driving. This complicates the language of choice. Americans were told that the automobile delivered freedom, and in countless ways, it did. It allowed families to travel, workers to reach opportunities, farmers to access markets, and communities to connect across extraordinary distances. But once cities and towns were rebuilt around universal driving, car ownership became less like an optional freedom and more like an entrance fee for independence. The physical street changed with that bargain. Children no longer treated it primarily as a playground. Pedestrians learned to gather at marked corners and wait for permission. Homes turned garages toward roads. Businesses measured accessibility through parking. Vast amounts of public land were dedicated not only to moving vehicles, but to storing them. The transformation became so complete that modern Americans often mistake its results for the natural shape of civilization. Its benefits cannot erase its cost. Modern vehicles are vastly safer than their ancestors because of seatbelts, airbags, crumple zones, better brakes, stronger standards, and improved emergency medicine. Fatality rates have fallen dramatically from some early peaks, yet tens of thousands of Americans still die in motor vehicle collisions during an ordinary year. The disaster is dispersed across thousands of roads, so it rarely feels like one national emergency. This does not mean licensing failed. Without testing, traffic rules, safer engineering, and enforcement, the losses would be far worse. The lesson is more uncomfortable. Societies can reduce a danger while also becoming dependent on the system producing it. They can celebrate improvement without asking whether the underlying design could have been different. They can call a problem inevitable after political and commercial choices have made alternatives difficult. That is why the history of the driver's license reaches beyond cars. It shows what happens when a transformative technology enters ordinary life faster than institutions can understand it. First comes wonder, then adoption, then profit. Harm appears, but regulation feels premature because the invention remains new. By the time the danger becomes undeniable, industries, habits, identities, and infrastructure have formed around keeping the technology in place. America's early automobile era therefore feels remarkably modern. New technologies still promise liberation before their consequences are fully understood. They enter homes, workplaces, relationships, and public life while laws remain unfinished. Their creators insist that misuse, not design, causes harm. Regulators arrive after habits have hardened. The names of the inventions change, but the struggle over speed, profit, responsibility, and public safety remains familiar. So return to the original question. Before 1903, could anyone simply drive? In much of America, the practical answer was yes. But the more revealing question is why meaningful testing took until 1959 to become universal. The delay was not caused by ignorance alone. It grew from fragmented government, devotion to individual freedom, commercial pressure, cultural persuasion, and society's willingness to adapt people to machines faster than it restrained machines for people. Perhaps America would build the system differently if it could begin again. Perhaps licenses would arrive before mass ownership, training before tragedy, and streets designed around human vulnerability rather than mechanical speed. Or perhaps the promise of freedom, profit, and convenience would overpower caution exactly as it did before. History cannot answer that hypothetical, but it can remove one comforting illusion. The world we inherited was never the only world possible. The driver's license in your wallet is therefore more than identification. It is the surviving artifact of a 56-year argument about who may exercise dangerous power in public, who must prove competence, and whose life matters when freedom creates risk. Behind that ordinary card stand, millions of machines, generations of casualties, corporate campaigns, public anger, and rules written only after the cost of having none became impossible to hide. And the next time a revolutionary technology asks society to trust it first and regulate it later, remember the streets before licenses. Remember how quickly convenience became dependence, how effectively responsibility was redirected, and how long basic safeguards took to arrive. The question is not whether progress should stop. It is whether progress should be allowed to decide by itself who pays for moving forward. If this history changed the way you see the road outside your door, subscribe for more stories hidden inside ordinary American life. And tell me in the comments, if the automobile were invented today, would America demand strict licensing before allowing mass adoption? Or would we repeat the same experiment and wait for the consequences?